Hey everyone, this is Cinemax. The following is an interview I did with Adrian Bruce. He's a semi-retired engineer that's been involved with two important companies in the music industry, Fairlight Instruments and Roland Corporation. At Fairlight, he was the system architect and lead designer of the CMI Series III, which was the company's first 16-bit sampler. In 1986, he left Fairlight to work for Roland, where he was directly involved with the A-880 MIDI Patchbay and both A-50 and A-80 MIDI keyboard controllers. His work as an R&D manager helped contribute and influence several Roland products, including the R8 Human Rhythm Composer and the VP9000 Variphrase processor. I must admit, doing these interviews takes me out of my comfort zone, but I do really appreciate getting to hear from people whose work has influenced my own. I'm also a big proponent of preservation, both for video games and electronic music instruments, so it's a great honor to be able to share these stories from Adrian. I hope you enjoyed the interview.
Thank you for inviting me. It's the first one of these type of things I've done.
A few years ago, I stumbled upon, I was on the Facebook group for the Fairlight users, and I think that's how I first encountered you, and then I found your autobiographical manga, which I found really fascinating because you give context to not only things that are happening in your life, but also things that are happening in the world. And I really like that because it kind of paints a broader picture of what was going on during the time.
Yes. And, well, that's because I stole the idea from this manga here, which is 4 volumes like this. It's a massive, great thing, but it's fascinating because it's not just him. So it wasn't my idea. I stole it.
First off, I guess we'll just start from the beginning. What really got you interested into computers and technology?
Originally, it was hi-fi. I originally started off because it was all about audio. I got involved with records and music, and for a birthday present, I was given a Panasonic mono tape recorder because I wanted it, and I started to record, songs off the radio by putting the cassette recorder in front of the radio. And then later, I got records, and for the longest time until I was in high school, my parents didn't have a record player. They didn't have records. They didn't collect records. My mother only ever listened to talkback radio, and my father didn't care. So I wanted. I got involved with music and records. So it was all about getting a record player at first. And so I eventually, when I was in high school, got involved with, well, my original first, to get involved with music was, in electronics, was because I needed to build a hi-fi, because I couldn't afford to buy one. And at the time, right, building them was actually a cheap thing to do and get involved with electronics. And you can buy kits and put them together, and that's what I ended up doing. And then joined the record club, and got lots of records and shared them. And then later, I got more involved with the making music type of thing, but it was originally all about hi-fi and playing records and that type of thing. It was my original interest in sort of electronics and technology, and that was when I was in high school.
Even back in the day, hi-fi units were probably a pretty hefty penny.
Yeah. I originally couldn't afford to buy a hi-fi, which is I ended up buying a BSR turntable, just the platter, and making my own wooden base for it. And at the time, the electronics magazines, like this type of thing, not this one, but the Australian version, had make your own amplifiers, and they were much cheaper than buying the commercial ones, which is what I originally did while I was in high school. I built stuff. And then later got involved with sound-on-sound recorders. And when I actually got a job, I could buy, reel-to-reel tape recorder and cassette decks and all that type of thing. So it was because of, I got involved with electronics because I couldn't, afford to buy anything, basically. I would have done that if I'd had the money, but I didn't have the money.
And so how did computers get into the equation?
I went to university because I was interested in, audio electronics. I wanted to design hi-fi amplifiers and all this sort of stuff, or rather studio gear. It wasn't so much, synthesizers and things like that I became interested in because of the records, through records. And I had quite a large record collection, and it had all sorts of things. I was in high school too. I wasn't a player at that time. I was just interested in synthesizers, but it wasn't until university I actually had like money and the knowledge to be able to make something and put something together. I went to university to study audio electronics and amplifiers and hi-fi and things like that. And then they had this is when microcontrollers started, microcomputers, and it was the end of the first year that I discovered microcontrollers that you could actually do something with them. And then I found out that that's actually a really useful thing. It's not like, because we started at university, you started doing programming in MIDI Tran, Fortran, and Pascal at the time. But that was like boring, accounting type stuff. It wasn't fun. Then I discovered with a microcomputer, you could actually connect it to stuff and control things. And and that's what I ended up running down and buying a keyboard matrix and scanning it up and connecting it to a microcomputer and a D-to-A converter and doing all sort of stuff and controlling some analog gear, basically from originally this magazine, building bits of this and controlling it. Didn't build the whole thing, and that's how I sort of started in electronics and computers, because there was an application for it which fed my interest in what became synthesizers type of things, and my interest in guitar sort of came around that time too, because I could get a second-hand guitar. So when I was in high school, I didn't play guitar because I didn't have one, and my parents didn't care about that type of stuff. They didn't even listen to music on the radio. And so it was because of microcomputers let you do that type of thing that I sort of ran down that rabbit hole of music technology, I guess, just because it was really, really fascinating. And there was Byte magazine and things like that had stuff about, connecting up computers to pipe organs, and a guy that ended up working for the people that did the first electronic piano. His name's Hal Chamberlain. He did a series of articles in Byte about making music as well with the microcomputers, and that was really fascinating to me at the time. So that's how I sort of got involved with technology. It was because of music originally, just playing music and hi-fi, and then studio gear and making synthesizers, and then making music with synthesizers, and then the playing, and it went on that way. And that you could do actually useful things with microcomputers, not business computers. You could actually connect up keyboards and scan them and things like that, which is what I did while I was at university. Learned how to do that and did it, wiring them all up. It was fascinating to me.
Definitely. And so after university, how did it come about you joining Fairlight?
Originally, I applied and got a job at an industrial control place, which I can't remember their name now. But I was getting a job and I was going to start it there. And I'd found out one of the people I would go to university with, we'd car share to go get to university. There was 3 of us. And it was his brother-in-law was in that company, and he told me that he was going to get that job. But the guy that was in there just was fascinated in me because I'd actually been building stuff. I went to university because I was fascinated in this stuff and was making things. And he wasn't that type of person. He was, he went to university because he wanted to be a manager. He hadn't built electronics or done anything like that. And the guy that gave me the job at this industrial control company, he was one of those people. He wanted somebody who could actually do something and contribute. But the day before I was supposed to start at this control company, I got a telegram saying that the job was not available anymore. So I assumed that it actually was given to the other guy's brother-in-law, and he went there. I have no idea. I actually did see him at an industrial control conference a few years later, and he wanted to employ me again, but I was at Fairlight at the time. So it's not what I ended up. And then there was just an ad in the paper for Fairlight, was looking for degree qualified people, because at the time, in when was this? 1981, 1982, there was no one actually in Fairlight that was degree qualified. And in Australia at the time, they had to have people degree qualified to be able to get the R&D grants. Because Australia was not a technological country, the government put in place a project, a system where they would assist to bootstrap technology in the company, electronics and things. And Fairlight was one of the people. They'd already had the product out then, but because they sort of qualified, they could get a grant, which originally started with $1 for $1 to do R&D. But you had to have degree qualified staff. So it was me and another guy from my year that was employed to be the degree qualified engineers in the company. So I sort of walked in there, and I got the job because I'd been doing all the synthesizer stuff and, you know, wiring up keyboards and things like that. Because in Australia, one of the biggest sort of project synthesizers that they had there was actually the ETI 4600, or at that time from a magazine called ETI. And it was actually one of the founders of Fairlight's father that owned that magazine empire. And he had been involved pushing and doing those, getting people to do those type of projects. Kim Ryrie, his father, owned the Modern Magazine's empire, which was all Electronics Today International in Australia and the Modern Motor and all these magazines. So it was actually ended up being, and Modern Hi-Fi or Hi-Fi Review. It was a very, very small community of what people involved in all these type of things. The people that did reviews and things that ended up being in the building where Fairlight ended up being in. So
everything's connected.
Things were connected, yeah. And I walked in and got the job pretty easy, because that was the sort of thing that I'd sort of been doing as a hobby, and I could show them what I've been doing. The other guy that got the job with me from my same year at university, he was more into classical violin and, you know, very condescending to modern music and all this type of thing. Was very much into opera and this type of thing, which is not the customers for Fairlight. It was all ended up being pop music and you know, English pop of the 80s mostly. So anyway, I was the right person at the right time with the right qualifications to walk into the place straight from university. It was an amazing opportunity. Yeah. And I was just lucky. I was the right person at the right time, and they'd had that. And the reason that the two guys that started the company could do it, because one of them had, you know, was from this, you know, very, very wealthy family.
Right.
You know,
right.
He could, you know, and they came from private schools and had the, you know, the money to be able to do different things.
No, definitely.
I mean, it's. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. What was some of the first things you did at Fairlight? Like, did you start working on the Series IIx and stuff?
One of the first things I did in the first week was there is that Kim had been told that there's these companding DACs. The DACs that were in the A-80 and D2As were linear, so all the bit sizes were the same in the Fairlight CMI. And he was told that these ones companding DACs, which was an exponential 8-bit curve. And he said, well, you know, we've been told we should try that. So could you make it up? And so the first thing I did, like in the first week I was there, was on prototype up, you know, the 5 chips or something to make 6 chips, to make an A-to-D and a D-to-A, so he could listen to it in the little studio that they had. And that was like the first project that I had. And then what I then spent the first year, over a year doing, was working in testing. Fairlight, they assembled all the boards in factory. They had a solder flow machine. At that time, it was all through-hole circuit boards.
Yeah.
You know, with 1/4-inch spacing between ICs, and they had their own factory staff there. It was half a dozen people who would, you know, put all the parts in, and then they'd run them through the flow soldering machine, and that would go into the testing department where you'd get them working, and then we had a torture chamber which put them through this dramatic heat and cold stresses, heat them up and cool them down to, you know, military grade specs. and then some number of them would die, and you'd repair those again. They'd go through the thing again. But that's one of the reasons why the actual gear in Fairlight is still working most of the time, because it was tortured to better than military grade testing it. And so I spent the first year at Fairlight actually in the testing department, stuff coming off, getting it working. And we had all sorts of problems at that time with things not working, and it was due to the poor quality of the circuit boards that were coming in from the PCB manufacturer. And we'd come in and they would have fingerprints on the tracks, or fingerprints under ICs and over tracks of just shorting things together. And I went there at one point, which actually I put one panel in my cartoon about things about this, and two guys there just said, well, we meet Australian standards for that. And I says, I don't care what your standards are. It's no good that there's fingerprints shorting out 70% of the tracks on the circuit boards, that they don't work when they're assembled. And then they said, no, we're doing the right thing. And Fairlight ended up taking the circuit boards away from Australian manufacturer and having them manufactured in Singapore, where problems completely vanished. Everything just worked the way it was supposed to. Plated through, holes were plated through. There were no fingerprints on the tracks. And the original Australian circuit board manufacturer went out of business because they were terrible. I won't mention their name, but it was just really appalling. The quality control and their just whole way of thinking about it was appalling.
Instead of having everything with a serial number, everything's personalized with a fingerprint.
And when the fingerprint shorting the tracks, so there's tracks with a fingerprint shape under an IC, you had to pull the IC, cut the tracks with a knife, and then put it back in and assemble it.
Jeez.
And that was in addition to the chips that failed because they were heated to, was it 70 degrees? We freezed up, and we had a heating system, which was I don't remember what it was. I think it was an air conditioner that heated into this small torture chamber, and then we had CO2 in massive industrial cylinders, which would then cool it down and freeze it. So there was condensation everywhere in this chamber.
Oh my God.
And these things were running these docking diagnostics all the time that we had running. And things would die and you'd replace them, and they'd go through this torture chamber until things came out. And then what happened is when things were assembled, they stayed working for many, 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 many years. It's not like your standard electronic product where it may fail after 3 years or 4 years or something or other.
Yeah.
And of course, at the time, components were a bit better quality than they are now. They're like almost designed to fail now, within a very, very short time. Designed to fail.
My wife, she has a DX7, and it still fires up. We're gonna have to probably do a cap job on it eventually, but I have these EMU modules from 2000. And I'm afraid of firing them up because it's like it's 2000s capacitors. I don't trust them.
Japan at the time, Japanese components were really, really, really high quality. You can still buy some high quality Japanese components, but if they're buying stuff from China or other places now, then they just don't last. Mostly like the electrolytic capacitors fail. So for the first year at Fairlight, I was involved in testing. I was at the end of the production line. I actually knew how everything worked, and I actually really, really good at getting things fixing. In one sense, it was really good that I knew everything that was wrong with it. For example, in the original Fairlight CMI, the video card was 3 cards. It was 3 cards.
Oh, wow.
Because one of it was because it had a video input, an overlay that you could do. You could feed a video signal in it, so it could put the text over the video.
Oh, really?
At that time, it was a composite video signal interface,
right.
The only thing that I remember that it was used in, there was an Australian TV program at the time. It used to be called Towards 2000, and it was like a half-hour news program of 10-minute segments about or 5-minute segments about new technologies and things. And the theme music for that show used to be the original Fairlight. It's done on the Fairlight when it started. And it ended up being the guy that did the theme music for that ended up being a programmer at Fairlight, but that's a different a different story. Very, very small community. So so I actually spent, you know, a whole year in there testing, and then I was actually getting boring with this. And the guy that originally gave me the job wanted me to start the other industrial control place, contacted me and say, well, I'm at this other new place and I could really use you, and you want to come and join me now? And I almost did. It was that's then when Peter moved us to actually R&D, when we had to, and I started to get the jobs to replace the existing boards in the system, which had components which were becoming unavailable. For example, in the video card, I think it had 3 boards because one of them was made from 4K memory chips. And another one was one of them was the pen interface. It used a light pen, and the other one was the actual control interface, because it could actually sync to an external video signal. That's how you could control it from a video signal coming in with a picture on it, and you could overlay that on that. And that had to be redesigned. And Fairlight didn't actually need the video overlay capability anymore. And for example, I made it 1 card. And I had it crystal locked instead of using the sync stuff, which meant the original CMIs, a Series I CMI, the actual video would sometimes jitter, because it was based on these things called multi-vibrators, monostables with RC component clocks, and there was a bit of noise on it and they would jump. So an old CMI, you can see that the screen may not be particularly stable. It'll shake horizontally a pixel or a couple of pixels sometimes. And getting rid of that was the way we got rid of it was I replaced the board. And also about that, so that was one of my first jobs, was just, you know, updating it so they can continue to manufacture the original CMI. And then there was an 8-inch hard disk that came along, which was like 20 megabytes, and it was an 8-inch. It was the same. The time we used 8-inch floppy disks, and the drive was, you know, it was this massive thing. You know, it was big, and the hard disk was the same size of that. And that was another job that I do. I had to. This was before SCSI. This was an SCSI. It was an SCSA interface. It was just, you know, Shoegate's associated computer interface or something like that. It was almost the same. It was a little bit different. So I had I connected up a hard disk to this big hard disk to this the CMI, but by making this SCSI interface for it. But the only thing is, the operating system at that time didn't understand about anything bigger than a floppy disk, so that the hard disk like 40 floppy drives. It wasn't very useful. It never actually went into a product or anything. It was for their planning of another thing they were doing. They had a salesman at one point at Fairlight. The sales guy, he thought they should have gone into business computers. So they actually went and designed this business computer at one point, and is that where the OS9? I don't remember now. That may be where the OS9 came from. It was for a business computer, rather than music stuff, because they thought that's where the money is, not in this music stuff.
I always thought, I've always loved the trapezoid monitor of the Fairlights. I just thought that would be such an interesting, almost like a Commodore PET sort of thing. Seeing that in an office environment, to me, that's fascinating.
Yeah. That was another thing that came out of this office thing, was the single. It was a monitor which had drives underneath it and a smaller card cage that went on the side of the box. That was all in the monitor thing. That was another short-lived device. I know that the guy that I worked with that joined the same time probably still has that. Has one of those. Wow. They didn't make very many of them. The sales guy that was pushing all this sort of stuff ended up leaving, and so I changed the direction again. I did actually, though, at one point do a design and build a single board. It was 16 inches by 8 inches business computer, which had the video graphics like video graphics, and it was a complete CMI effectively. Not CMI.
So it had like
the CPU. It was a 6809 and graphics and memory all on the one board, 64K memory. They're going to make an office computer with that. So I designed and made that at one point.
Was it just the one 6809?
Yeah, it was a one 680. It was only a single 6809 at that time, not the dual thing.
Gotcha.
Because the actual computer part of the Fairlight was inherited from the Qasar Computer company, which this guy Tony Furse had made and been running for years, and that was what Fairlight sort of inherited or got involved with. I'm not quite sure of the history of that now, but he had an industrial control company, so he built computers that could control stuff. And then he also made a fancy digital synthesizer himself.
Yeah,
it was a great massive thing, which was, I think it was called the Qasar 8.
M8 or something.
M8, something like that. It was a I never saw one, but I did see pictures of it. Massive numbers of circuit boards in it.
It's giant, yeah.
Yeah, this massive great thing. Because the original Fairlight was based on these Vero, just the standard stuff you buy at a hobby store, Vero rack hardware. You can probably still even buy it. I see stuff around now which is still using the hardware. And it was all based in that. So they sort of inherited the computer side of things and the operating system and everything from this other company, Qasar Computers, this Tony Furse guy, older engineer. And another thing I did then was this office computer single board thing with the other guy. We got it working, and then they decided that wasn't going to go ahead. And then I had to, and then I'd made the hard disk that connected this thing. Then I had to redesign something else. I don't remember what that was. Then it could have been, we did also made another big office computer keyboard. Fairlight made their own computer keyboard, you know.
Yeah.
You know, you didn't buy these things. They didn't have these things at that time. And so they made them own with this, you know, buying the switches, Hall effect switches. And
I'm really glad you brought up the alphanumeric keyboard, because to me it's so fascinating. It's such a bulky, like compared to modern days, it's a bulky with the Hall effect switches. For viewers who don't know at home, we're used to like just clicky keyboards. The Hall effects, they're like magnetic, and so you just press them down, and there's no articulation force, so there's no click. And so I remember Peter Vogel talking about how they had to put a clicker in it so you can get the typewriter click sound. Yeah,
it was just a relay. It was just a
relay, exactly.
It was just a relay, so that the contacts would go click, click, click when you pressed it. Yeah.
I just find that really amusing.
So one of the things I did with Quentin was it was an office computer keyboard, so it was a big thing. It was more like what the IBM PC keyboard became. It's big thing with the alphanumeric on the other side and whatever. It was a lot of extra keys on it for whatever it was now, and we had to write the code to do that. So I remember doing that, and at the time we didn't have any way of debugging code inline or anything. So it was you'd write some code, blow an EEPROM, which took a while. I think it had 2K 8-bit EEPROMs at the time, and you'd plug it in, see if it worked. You could put some test code in to flash some lights on the keyboard, and that's the sort of the way that you got the thing going, by just having a whole stack of these EEPROMs and a EEPROM eraser, continuously erasing the ones, because they used to take, I don't remember, was it half an hour? Was it 20 minutes or something to erase an EEPROM? You used to have a stack of these things, and it took. I mean, it's unbelievable now how fast something is to program, but it used to take a while to like a programmer. A 2708 was like a 1K EEPROM at the time, and 2K I don't remember, but it really took a while, and you had to plug these things and see if it worked, and you had to flash LEDs on the keyboard to debug anything, because there's no other way to do it.
Oh wow!
It's not the way I did things later at all. You'd have a port and a monitor and all sorts of things. That was the way that it was designed for us to do. We didn't design the hardware. We got the code going, and it wasn't actually me. It was the other guy from Unity that mostly did most of the code, because he was more not a hardware person. He was more interested in software. So he can.
Gotcha. And that was the system disk operating system and stuff like that, or
No, this was just a keyboard for this office machine.
the office machine, right?
It was just a keyboard, so there was a ROM in it, and it just had serial out, which at the time was like 9800 baud serial out with keys on it. It was a bigger version of the Fairlight keyboard.
Gotcha.
That we did, and then after that, so we had to do stuff to keep the Series 1 in production. Like I did the video card. I also had to do a new floppy disk drive, because the original 8-inch drives on the Fairlight Series 1 were single density drives. I don't even remember how much that was. It wasn't very much, and I designed a double density floppy disk using a fancy digital data separator. So that was one of the second projects that I did. So it wasn't music stuff. It was like graphic videos and disk interfaces, floppy disk interfaces. And we got that going. So that doubled. I think a double density 8-inch floppy drive was like 880 kilobytes or something.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah, it was something like that. It could have been 800 kilobytes. The small flop, or 1.1, the 3-inch floppies that we had before they vanished were like 1.44 meg.
Yeah.
And that was half of that, on these big drives.
There's a photo of like Peter Vogel, and I forgot who else is in the they're holding. I never like, when you see the Fairlight in pictures, you never really get like a sense of like the scale, or even like in the 80s TV footage. But like there was a recent photo with Peter Vogel, and he's holding the Fairlight. I'm like, oh my god, it's a mainframe. The thing is
it's
huge.
It's a big box, a big heavy box. It had a steel frame around it, and then this rack in the front and a rack in the back. And the guy that used to make that actually died. Alan Galt was the guy. I actually have a thing on my webpage about that. Alan Galt, that we get together. He used to make everything in his garage, basically. And he'd go to some other facilities for doing other machining and things. But he was the guy that did most of the R&D metalwork stuff in Australia at the time, in Sydney anyway, for many, many years. And he was still doing it until he died. 2018, I think it was.
Yeah.
I have a thing on my website mentioning him.
Yeah. But was he the guy that also did like the woodwork for like the monitor case as well?
He was the guy that got it. He was involved with getting all that done. He didn't actually cut the wood. There was another company that did the machining of the MDF to make the cases. But he was the guy that was responsible for that type of stuff. He probably designed the.
He probably designed it. Gotcha.
Alan. He did all that kind of stuff.
So you were still with Fairlight. I'm not still with, but you joined Fairlight when the Series 1 was still in production.
Yes, I joined when the Series 1 was in production.
Okay, gotcha.
And the Series 1 was in production, and we had to modify some things because some of the parts were unavailable. So it's like 4K memory chips. So I spent the first year and a bit just in testing, making the things.
Yeah.
And the only R&D I had at that time was software, improving software, updating the software, and adding features and stuff. And then after a year and a half, I then got involved with redesigning boards that needed to be designed, and adding a hard disk interface, and redesigning the floppy, and redesigning the graphics cards. Somebody else redesigned the CPU. It went from a dual 6800 to a dual 6809, and that was probably Peter Vogel that did that. Dual 6809. And the reason I went to the 6809 was because they wanted to go to this OS9 multitasking operating system, proper operating system. But I wasn't involved with that. And then, but between actually working on new CMI things, there was this sort of section where we were involved with probably getting into these office computers, where we did this fancy keyboard, and then there's this what else did we and that had dual 680nines in it too, because they wanted to run this OS9 in this business computer that was a desktop, big desktop unit. It was sort of like the Fairlight monitor, except it was bigger and it had floppy drives underneath it, I think, from memory, 2 8-inch drives underneath it. It had a card cage, small card cage in the side for the exact same boards. And then we did that and then I made a single board computer that would probably be a replacement for that, and then they changed their mind, they weren't going to do that. And then I designed other things to replace that. And then we're going to do the 2X. And the 2X, one of the main things to do the 2X was they were doing, the Series 2 had the 68009 CPUs in it. And it had the new graphics card I'd done, or the replacement graphics card and the replacement, and it had the hard disk in it. No, it didn't have the hard disk in it. I don't think it ever supported a hard disk. That was being used in this Office thing, which then I think they made a couple of Office computers or something, but it actually ended up going away. The operating system we used in the original Fairlight was
QDOS?
QDOS, yes. It was something that Motorola had, and it actually originally came from Tony Furse, the guy that was like, he was like the Motorola dealer or something. He's the guy that originally did the Qasar hardware rack and the original CPUs and video cards and things like that.
Yeah.
And the original digital synthesizer thing. It was him. So Fairlight sort of inherited all. I don't know the business arrangement between them. And that's why they took it over. And that was why it was based on this dual CPU thing. And it was Peter Vogel that had done the original voice cards for the CMI.
I've always been fascinated by the actual hardware of the Series IIx, and like how there's like 2 CPUs in there. They have very preliminary emulation of the Fairlight CMI in MAME, which is this emulator, and I fired it up a couple times and got to mess around with the page D and stuff like that. But I've also been able to look at the debugger and see all the hex and memory jumping around.
Yeah,
like it was. I remember seeing in the memory just like constantly flipping back and forth.
Well, even the original Series 1 CMI had a 64K memory card in it, but the actual video card used 16K, and that had to be paged out. It had to be paged into memory and paged out, or on the TC, you could control where it was. There was 2 CPUs that saw the same didn't necessarily see the memory. It could see the same memory and it didn't. And so I don't know. I don't remember now. But there was two 6800 CPUs, and one of them's job was mainly the graphics card.
Right.
And it had to page stuff in and out to access something else. So you had to do paging to actually put there was 64K of memory, and there was a 16K of memory for the video card, and it had to be paged in and out. That could have been what you were seeing, but there was actually 2 CPUs as well. And so that they each saw slightly different arrangements from memory. I don't remember now. I don't really remember very much about that type of thing. The sort of software that I did on the original 6800 was diagnostics for like the new graphics card, doing memory tests and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It didn't have anything to do with the CMI music software at all.
Right.
So we were involved in making tests writing tests. Because when they went into production, there was a sequence of testing and writing and reading and writing and doing stuff on the graphics card and testing for memory errors or solder shorts and all sorts of stuff. So I did all that kind of stuff, but nothing musical at Fairlight.
Right.
That wasn't my job at all. I was the hardware design that did the firmware, the software to prove that the hardware was right, and test the hardware and the test software and the diagnostic software for the hardware, but I didn't actually do any music software. And then they decided that they wanted to move to the 6809 processor rather than the 6800 because it was more modern, it was easier, and it gave you access to C. There was C compilers for it. I think that was probably, and there was OS9.
Right.
The reason they have OS9 because you could then write code in C rather than assembler. The original CMI was written in self-modifying 6800 assembler code. And just to get the performance, it would rewrite instructions in memory so the next time it came through, something else would happen. I mean, in computer science, that's like verboten and is a terrible thing to do. But when it comes to getting something done in a certain amount of time, so it actually works efficiently from a speed perspective, that's a technique that was used in the original CMI. And in the 680, and in this, when they moved the Series 2 in the 6809, they had to get rid of all of that stuff. Or they did get rid of that stuff. But they also had to rewrite. They had to rewrite bunches of it to work better or more efficiently with the 6809 processor, which is what was in the Series 2. And then I don't remember what the X stood for in the Series 2. The X was maybe the new channel cards. I don't remember now.
Or MIDI.
MIDI came. Could have been. MIDI was another card that we added in there. I don't remember. It could have been because the voice cards changed.
Right.
The original CMI had the low pass filter on the output it used CMOS switches to switch them very quickly to do the low pass filter. Because you had to because the Fairlight used a variable sample rate, so it always output in a waveform. It always output all of those samples. It output them slower or faster to get the different pitches.
Yeah.
And you had to have a tracking filter over that to get rid of the zipper noise that you get from a D to A converter. You had to follow that has to follow around to filter out the noise that you get from doing that. In this original Series 1 cards, it was they used CMOS switches and switched them very quickly to do that. But it also got these funny out effects, which we called B-flat birdies. There'd be this intermodulation distortion of playing a certain sound or components in a sound with whatever the cutoff frequency was, but whatever it was like not particularly controllable. So it was called B-flat birdies was the effect. And to get rid of that was one of the reasons to redo the voice cards got redone in a Series 2. Basically the output end got changed to VCF chips, Curtis, SSM and VC. Different times that was an SSM and Curtis chips and VCA and a DBX VCA. So that the channel card changed at a certain point through then with its Series 2, I think it was. I think that's what the Series 2 was that changed the CPUs to be able to use 6809. I mean, because the processor was actually software compatible, but they made some changes in the process of getting rid of this to make it easier to maintain.
How exactly does like sample playback work on the Fairlight in terms of like how does it with like since the memory is on the channel card, right? Like how does like the CPU?
The CPU just saw a whole bunch of registers controlling each for the voice cards in the original CMI. Well, even all of the CMIs, there was an interface, a port that you controlled stuff through, and that had the RAM memory on it, and you set the pitch and you set what the starting envelope was or the envelope rate or things like that. Because on the original CMI cards, it used timer ICs to control volume. There was D to A converters for doing volume. The processor, it could only write, like for example, for on the original CMI to write the same sound, whatever the sound was, to all of the channel cards, you'd write to a register over on the thing called the master card that I want all of the cards accessed. There was a bit for each card, and then I'm going to write to this port, and you just wrote the bit to the same location, and it ended up being written into all of the memory sequentially.
I see.
It was a port that you're written to. You didn't have direct access to any of the memory, so it wasn't that the memory was like sitting in the CPU space. It wasn't set up like that. It was a port that you could read bits and bytes backwards and forwards through this thing.
I see.
And set the address you're reading and writing to, and set what the looping points are and things like that. It was a separate memory that wasn't like part of the CPU space.
Gotcha.
And that kind of changed on the Series 3, but I'm not up to that yet.
Well, that might be a good segue to get to the Series 3, because that's your real bread and butter there. That's your baby. So
yeah, the Series 3, but I was involved with, like, in developing. I mean, I didn't do it. Well, the way that started was that, okay, we'd done the Series 2 and they had the Series IIx out, which was an improvement with the filters and things on this existing 8-voice system. But they wanted to go to 16-bit better quality sound. But before we did the Series 3, I actually did a 12-bit voice card, which is basically the voice card which is in a Series 2, except it had 12 bits of memory, and it was all modified to be 12 bits of memory, and it had the same, you know, DBX, VCA and stuff that were on that. I only made one prototype card, but it had 12 bits of memory and a 12-bit DAC on it that was better quality. I think 12 bits is like 72 dB silver noise ratio, something like that. And is it? I don't remember now. Something like that. Much better than the 48 that you got with an 8-bit system. And that was what Kim at one point thought he wanted. So I'd prototype one of those cards. It was like working. I could play sounds and things like that. And then they said, nah, this is not a step forward enough. So that all got stopped, and we had meetings about, you know, what should we do next? Oh, and it was like, oh, we should have, you know, we have 16-bit we've got to have 16-bit sounds, and, you know, all this group memory, and be able to share the same sound with different channel cards. Because in the original system, one 16K by 8-bit sound could only make one voice, and you had to have multiple voices, multiple cards with same copies of the memory in it to make the sounds. And in the Series 3 design, it was said, well, okay, we have one big, huge block of memory, which all the cards can access, as well as other things can access. And that was the architecture that we sort of set in a bunch of meetings, and I went away and designed that and did all the circuit diagrams for. And there was a bunch of meetings, which Tony Furse was involved with. It was interesting because Tony Furse was a chain smoker, and Peter Vogel, one of the guys originally in Fairlight, was the complete. He hated smoking. He was completely against smoking, but and so they didn't get on because of that. I remember at one point being in the meeting, and Tony Furse, because he was a much more, you know, experienced, older outside person, you know, lit a cigarette, and Peter just had to sit there, I think, from memory. He couldn't say to stop him. Because Peter was very much involved with protesting against smoking, which is the way things were now. You know, smoking is banned like everywhere now, but at the time it wasn't. You know, he was involved with protesting, you know, and being involved with protests about, you know, banning smoking, everything. So they were successful eventually. So that was one of the things that Peter did in his spare time. And it was sort of partly because Peter was involved with, you know, all that type of thing in his spare time, that I had, you know, so much involved with designing the Series 3. Andrew Cannon was the main software programmer.
I see.
That was actually in there, and I sort of like discussed him with Peter about, okay, this is this and this and this. For example, at one point, I wanted to do a constant sample rate to output the waveform, which is the way that every other sampler works. Your Ackeyes and your emus, they all work that way. They did it that way. But at the time, Andrew says, no, well, I've got all this code, and it works this way, and we want to have this variable sample rate, you know. And so it was because of it, you know. Andrew says that we're not changing that part, you know, that keeps the same. And so it used the same way of generating pictures and stuff that the original things did, and got incorporated into the Series 3. But I just made it so that it shared memory, and it had 16-bit memory. And we added a 68K processor on that memory bus, so that it could, all the channel cards and it could share and do stuff at the same time, as well as the original 8-bit computer, you know, dual 6809 computer, which eventually, after I left years later, they eventually practically stopped using it, and everything moved to the 6800, which then became a bigger 6800 family device, the 68,000 family device. I had discussions with people, and then I ended up drawing all the schematics for like the 68K on the waveform bus, with all the memory and 16-bit waveform memory, was called the waveform processor, the waveform master. Then there was the channel cards, which also had individual processors on it, but the actual memory the waveform didn't come back to them. They just generated the addresses and what memory to output and the pitches and things like the control envelopes and filter envelopes and stuff. And then there was still the original computer that was inherited from the CMI, which originally it actually controlled everything, but that sort of all migrated after I'd left them years later. So I designed all these boards at 68,000, the channel cards with their own 6809 processors on them, the master card, which is the thing that had the main pitch reference, main clock reference, which was then bused to all of the cards, which it divided down to generate the pitches, to generate to drive the DACs eventually. That was on the channel cards, what pitches things were and what to access where. And so I designed all these circuit diagrams. Used to draw it on A3 paper. A3 paper was, A3 is not a US size, but it's a larger size paper in pencil on graph paper. So you still had on the back of graph paper, so you could still see where everything was. Do everything with templates, and do I still have templates here? I probably still have the template that I used back then. That's not one of the templates that nah. I do have somewhere the templates, but things about that big with logic gate symbols and things on it. And the drew them pencil.
Way before Photoshop and all these.
There was
schematic.
no CAD. There was no CAD in any of this thing. It was all pencil drawn on sheets of paper, drawn up, pin numbers assigned. The pin numbers usually end up being assigned mostly by the people that laid out the circuit boards. We didn't lay out the circuit boards because the circuit boards were these massive, great things done with tape. And they worked out the best way to lay the tracks down. So depending on what it was, they allocated what some of the pin numbers were. We didn't allocate all of the pin numbers to the ICs, just the main control ones. But when it comes to, if it was easier to run tracks this way and this way, then they would change or update the pin number, the data IO pins as needed to make the circuit board doable. And then what we did, I took the channel cards and the master card, and I took those and debugged those. But at that time, we actually got another company to wire wrap them. We used wire wrap at that time. And so from the basic schematics, pencil on paper schematics, we sent them out to this other guy who had these people, and they wire wrapped the prototype boards together, making mistakes along. And then I gave the waveform processor and the master card, the 68K, to the other guy I worked with, Quentin, and I did the other ones. And then we sort of worked on them together because they could sort of almost be independent. Well, to get mine working to a certain state, I still needed the memory card. But I think we might have made two of those at one point. I don't remember now. The waveform memory was a new thing, and we had to make a new bus as well, of course, because it was all completely different from the CMI. On the original CMI, there was an original 8-bit computer with the floppy disks and controllers and stuff on the far right, and then there was the channel cards and things, and at one point from the channel cards, and then there was the main processor. Then there was the 68K card went in there, and then the bus changed to this 16-bit data and whatever 24-bit address lines. I don't remember what it was now. I think it was only had 24-bit address lines for the rest of the bus. So that part of the CMI was different. So it was a new motherboard in the Fairlight. And I don't remember exactly the process of how we might have made another a memory card at that time. I don't remember, or it could have been the same one. I don't remember now because the only way I could load memory into it was using the 68K. So I might have had one at some time, or it was together. I don't remember how we did that now. But we separated it up. We got them working. I mean, there was wiring mistakes in the process to get it all working. And then we went to another. Once we got it sort of working well enough, then we went to have a circuit board made. Circuit boards made, and then it's easier to modify a circuit board by add chips or take some or cut tracks than it is to work with the wire wrap, because it just becomes a whole mess and unreliable. And I don't remember now how many revisions we had to do to get something reliable, but it eventually came together. But of course, the only thing that worked at that time was our software, because the software team was still coming to grips with getting OS9 up and running and their system together, and the staff and knowing about all that type of thing.
No, I mean the Series 3 is incredible because it's like again, it's with the sampler being the first to have that CD audio quality.
Yeah, well, actually, I have the original brochure here.
Oh wow.
Yeah, this is one of the few. I used to have all the original manuals and stuff, the schematics, but I threw all those things away a few years ago. Well, that's the main picture there. It's really quite artistically drawn. And PageR, of course, was the thing that really made the CMI in the music industry. The software team originally, moved the code from the original 609s to the 68K, because at first the 68K just moved stuff into memory and back again, but then they worked out, hey, this actually thing is way faster and way more efficient. But that was nothing to do with me, and that was years after I left and went to Japan.
Well, and again, let's use that as a segue, because when was it? What year was it when you decided to join Roland?
I think it was end of 1985. But the reason I decided to leave Fairlight was because Peter wanted to move the whole company up into the mountains 2 hours from Sydney. He wanted to, from Sydney, it's about 2 hours drive, I guess, up into the mountains, and there's a place called Springwood, and he wanted to, that's where he had bought a place and was going to build a place up there. They still don't have fast internet. And I had no interest in moving to, it's pretty much the countryside.
Right.
Because as a kid, my mother's parents lived, what was it? It was 400 kilometres north of Sydney, up in a place called Telegraph Point and Port Macquarie, which was basically just a little holiday town. And then it was, absolutely nothing there. Absolutely nothing there. There was like I think there was the ABC, that was the government like TV station, and that was it. There was like nothing there. So I'd spent a lot of my time there, and I had no interest in being in a place like that.
Yeah.
I, with my wife, I said I don't no interested in moving to the mountains, and so my wife wanted to go back to Japan. My wife is Japanese, and would prefer to go back to Japan and live there. And she said I could be an English teacher, but I'm no interest in being an English teacher. I've done this electronic stuff. So let's contact Roland, because I had Roland stuff. I had a TR-606, I had a TB-303. At that time, I had like a Prophet 1 monosynth, and that was the interest. And so my wife and I wrote a letter to Roland, and I ended up, when I was working at Fairlight, I ended up getting a call from Mr. Egan at the time, who was the Roland Australia president, who was in Sydney, and he said, "Oh, they're, I've got, I'd like to talk to you. Would you like to come out and visit me?" And so I went out there and talked to him, and I said, "That's quite interesting." And then this was during, and then what happened? Then sometime there was the first CMI Series 3 was being shown in Tokyo. The Series 3 was being shown in Tokyo. My wife was pregnant at that time, so she came with me too, and she was going to her parents' place in Kyoto, which is where I am now. And I went to Tokyo, which was the introduction to the Fairlight Series, introduction of the Fairlight Series 3 into Japan. And they had showed all of the big people there. And at that time, Tomita Isawa came. He had his own private demonstration, but I was there with him. I wasn't the actual demonstration person. I was the technical person. There was a musician guy that was actually there, that was actually doing the demo. He had the demo and did the demo for these people. And then on the way back to, that was in Tokyo, and Hamamatsu is halfway between Tokyo and Osaka, and Kyoto is a bit further towards Tokyo than Osaka. So on the way to my wife in Kyoto, staying at her parents' place, I stopped off at Hamamatsu, which is where Roland headquarters was, and I met Mr. Kakehashi, who's founder of Roland, who died a few years ago now, and at that time the head of R&D, which is a Mr. Kikumoto, and I had lunch with them in Hamamatsu. I think it was there's the Concord the main hotel used to be, was it the Concord Hotel? There's the big hotel which is close to the station. I think it was the Concord Hotel. I don't remember now. And I had, or was it Osaka? No, I think it was Hamamatsu. I stopped at Hamamatsu and met them. Stayed overnight in the hotel, and I met them and had a lunch and a discussion. And with Mr. Kakehashi and Mr. Kikumoto. And Mr. Kikumoto said, no, it must have been in Osaka. My wife came with me. I don't remember the details now, but I don't remember where it was now, but I met them. My wife was with me. And at one point, Mr. Kikumoto says, but I don't like foreigners in Japanese. And then shortly after that, Mr. Kakehashi said to us, when do you want to start? And said, okay. So what happened, I ended up quitting Fairlight, and then I worked in Roland Australia, in the offices of Roland Australia for 12 months. It ended up being 12 months before moving to Japan, Hamamatsu, Japan. And it was partly because it took so long because Roland gave me a sponsored visa. Now, I had a Japanese wife. It would have been actually much faster and easier if I'd got just a spouse visa to come to the country, but we didn't quite know about that at the time, and Roland organised it. So it ended up taking like 9 months to get me a visa. And in that time I did in the Roland Australia offices, I actually did a thing called the A-880 MIDI Patchbay.
Yeah. It was
a 1U rack, 8 in, 8 out, where you could mix two of them together, two channels, two of the inputs together, and send that out. And you could route things. It was programmable and all that sort of stuff. So it was a MIDI Patchbay with mixing capabilities on two of those channels. So I did that while I was waiting for this visa stuff to happen in Australia. So that was actually quite an interesting time. I got to be in the Roland offices and the different way things work there. I'd met some famous people in Roland Australia, but in Fairlight in Australia, but I was just one of those. Oh, and he works on something here. And I don't even remember if they told me my name. Like I have an album from Peter Gabriel.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, for example, I have here this autographed.
This is where the smoke comes out.
This is where the smoke comes out. And this was a Christmas party, and Peter Gabriel was there, and he'd already signed all these things, and that was given to me, and I met him and whatever. But he was quite high, and he didn't really say very much.
Oh, sorry for interrupting, but you know, speaking of celebrities, you also, I remember reading on your manga, Florian Schneider from Kraftwerk.
Yeah. Yes, and that was when I was still in the technical department. That was still the first year I was there. I was sort of in the technical department, and Peter and Kim had come in, and Kim was sort of like the president of the company, and then Kim Ryrie, he was like the president and the sales guy. And then the other guy was Peter Vogel, who was like the technical guy. And Kim said, well, I've got someone turning up, so could you calibrate the CMI in the demonstration room? Which is, a demonstration room was about the size of my little office here. It's about, what's this? It's about 8 feet by 8 feet, very, very small, with a machine set up in it. So, and there was you ran a test program, and there was a bunch of pots on the front of all of the channel cards that you adjusted for minimum feed through of a signal. So I was doing that, and then while I was doing this secretary brought in this Kraftwerk guy, and he said, "Oh, what are you doing?" "Oh, I'm calibrating this up." I knew who he was. I knew who he was, but you know, I was being cool about it. And he just asked a bunch of questions, and I said, "Oh, I'm setting this up." Well, and he was, "Well, why aren't you using a bunch of equipment?" And I said, "Oh, no, you do it by ear." The ear is very sensitive to a null. You adjusted this thing so that the signal got. There's a 10 point on each card. There was a 10 turn pot, which is a lot of turns in this thing that you adjusted, played the special test signal, and you adjusted it so that it was at a minimum. The feed through was at a minimum. The signal got the smallest. You can hear that very well with headphones on, and you adjust it. And that was the setup that I had to do before the demonstration. And but the guy turned up early, and the secretary just brought him in with me. And I said, "Oh, I'm just calibrating." He says, "Oh no, you should be using test gear for doing all this type of thing." So I did that. Oh, okay. And then like I didn't get to introduce myself or anything. And she didn't introduce him, but I knew who he was. And then I did something else, and then I said, and then I set it all up and put the original system back in it. And he says, "Well, okay, it's all done now. You can use it if you want." And then he said, "Well, why would I want to use it?" And I was like, "Well, but why are you here?" You know, I didn't say that. And then about then Kim came in, and started talking with him. And I said, "Oh, okay, thanks." And I went back to the lab where I was still testing. I was assembling boards and testing things and stuff. So it was a quite strange encounter, you know, and he was just really pushing it. "I know you're doing it wrong." And but you know, he wasn't touring or anything. He must have just been holidaying in Australia or something.
Right.
He wasn't with the band or anything. He was just very casually dressed.
Yeah.
But his attitude was just seeming really. Everybody else was, "Oh, please let me touch it," but they already had one. So I don't know what he was doing, but he was like offended that I suggested that he could use it while, you know, now that it was working, which I thought was really strange. You could have said, "No, thanks, right, I'm fine, thanks," you know, or something. But it was like acted offended. Very strange.
Yeah, really. It's like, where's the oscilloscopes? Where's all the cool sci-fi gear? You know.
Because it was just done by ear. This final thing of minimizing the feed through of the VCAs was the VCA. This is before it was a VCA. It was just a multiplying DAC on the output. There was a pot to adjust it for minimum feed through. I met Jean-Michel Jarre at one point in Fairlight. He was touring Australia. No, he wasn't. Really? Giving a concert, but he was just touring the country, and he came in, and I was in the testing department. I was still in the I wasn't doing an R&D there. I was still in the, you know, testing boards, part of the factory type thing. And he came through, and I probably, you know, it was like, well, here's a guy, one of the guys that makes the, you know, the test stuff.
Yeah.
It was, and then later Mike Oldfield came through, because he's a big Fairlight user. And he came through. He was a bit more talkative. He actually invited us all to his concert.
Oh, wow.
Which was pretty cool. We all, I think, Peter and Kim were probably, you know, on stage or at the back of stage or some side of stage or something. But we were at the back of the hall, standing against the back wall. But it was still, he was a bit more talkative.
Yeah.
I met a few people at that time, but I was never introduced to anybody.
Right.
It's like I've got Peter Gabriel's autograph here, but he was high and didn't say didn't even know I was a person probably at the time.
I wanted to ask you, like, what's it like living in Japan? Like, how, uprooting yourself from Australia, and like when I watch videos on YouTube I see of Japan, it's like everything seems to be a lot more smaller, a lot more compact and everything, and compared to like my American way of living where everything's just like so spread out and everything.
Well, when we moved to Hamamatsu, that's sort of like the Japanese countryside, and so we had our own house. We've never lived in like an apartment block or anything. We had our own house. We had a car. We drove everywhere in Hamamatsu. So in many ways, it's very similar to Sydney. It's just everything's just more compact, and the rooms are smaller. And it used to be, and the tops of the roof doors were lower. So that if you didn't bend down, I would hit myself here on the top of the door going into a room. This place is different. They've they've made them much bigger now, so there's not that worry. But when it comes to it, because I was in the countryside, in Hamamatsu, you used to have to drive everywhere. It's the same as you did in Sydney. There wasn't any railway. There was a bus, but you just drove shopping and did everything. So in that case, it was quite similar. I mean, things are more compact, and there's more. Hamamatsu is like the countryside by Japanese standards, but it's probably more city-like than Sydney is in Australia, for example. In many ways, from and then being in Kyoto, it's even more compact. The roads are more tighter and things like that. But there's a train that's a 5-minute walk away, and I can get to Osaka in an hour, and I can get to downtown Kyoto in 15-20 minutes. So it's small, it's compact, but it's I tend to think that the people in Australia with their big lawns and things like that, it's a complete waste of space. It's all this trying to be the English green thing. It's just and people. In Australia, we had a house and lawns, and you had to mow them all the time, and you had to, it was all this upkeep, and unless you had that for fun, it was just a waste of time and space. I mean, the place we have now, there's no garden. There's some pot plants and things like that around the side, which my sister-in-law looks after, but no, there's I can do plenty of things without having to spend my time looking after a garden. No, thank you.
Yeah, like right now, I have like, okay, do I have the remainder of my paycheck for like a lawnmower or for another synth? It's like it's like decisions, man. Because like living in Florida, the grass here just grows insane with the rain and everything, and so it's mandatory to have a lawnmower, which I don't have. So it's like I'm tired of hitting everything with a weed whacker, but
yeah. Well, here we don't have any lawn around our property. We've got stones and everything. And we keep it that way. So there's no lawn to mow or look after.
Way less upkeep.
Yeah. It's just there's a few pot plants which my sister-in-law has, and she looks after them, which is fine by me.
Speaking of Japanese culture and everything, my wife, she loves manga and anime, but like I remember it was just so fascinating, like the first time reading your manga, you'll see all the Fairlight stuff, and all of a sudden I see Evangelion, because that's one of my wife's favorite animes as well, and it's such an influential one. And I wanted to get from your perspective, because like, correct me if I'm wrong, you were the first audience to watch that anime and stuff like that, and when it was first on TV back like in, was it 95?
Well, no, I don't remember when it was on it. Well, Evangelion. Well, when it comes down to Akira came out the year that I came to Japan, right? And and in all the music magazines, the Japanese keyboard and all this type of thing, it had that Akira bike picture on it, and it was talking about the music and stuff. And I thought, well, that's a really cool looking bike. I actually do have a little model in the display case over there. Of the toy, the Akira's red bike, bike, and and that was when like the new Akira really kickstarted a new anime thing in Japan. It was a real starting thing, and that came, the year I was here, it came out, and I just noticed it because of all the magazines. It was all on all the music magazines. Roland had all the racks of music magazines everywhere, and they were all on the covers, shortly after I was here. And I thought, well, that's a really cool looking bike. I didn't actually see Akira for many, many years, but that was when I sort of first knew about it.
Yeah.
And then when I went to Japan, my youngest son was like 9 months old. So he didn't actually start watching much on television and kids' cartoons till a bit after that. And then the next big thing was Evangelion. They used to show where we lived in Hamamatsu. They used to show things like TNG probably started before Evangelion did. The Star Trek: The Next Generation started in Japan years before they started showing that in Australia, and it was on I think it was a Wednesday night at like 2 a.m. And so you had to record it. I recorded it on VHS tapes, and that was where I saw Star Trek: The Next Generation. It was on. They broadcast it in English and Japanese, and you could select which one you wanted to listen to. And TNG, and that was amazing. And then, so I was actually used to this, was it 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. time slot on a Wednesday morning for having cool stuff on. And that was when Evangelion started, when it did start, whenever that was now. But I'd actually been recording other things before then. There was another thing I used to record way before then was Hunter. Was it Hunter? I'd have to look at the machine here. It was a comedy. Sledgehammer. No, the program was called Sledgehammer. They showed that too.
Is that the live action show?
It was a live action show called Sledgehammer.
Yeah,
he was this really ultra violent cop, but it was a comedy.
My mom and dad have shown that to me before a couple of times. I know what you're talking about.
And they had that on too, and it was hilarious. And they had things like that on. It was the same time slot, and that time slot then became Evangelion when it started, whenever that was.
I can't believe I glossed over Akira because I love cyberpunk stuff, and that anime is just such a timeless classic, and a defining piece of art in the cyberpunk genre, and just the animation, to this day, watching it on Blu-ray is just it's unbelievable. So you had the MIDI Patchbay, and then what was the next product after that?
I did the MIDI Patchbay when I was in Sydney, Australia, in the Roland offices, and then I moved to Roland, Japan, the Hosoi factory. They'd organised us a house, 5 minutes walk away from the Hosoi head office, which is where Mr. Kakahashi's office was. The piano department was, the synthesizer department, the pro synthesizer department was, and the factory that manufactured the Roland keyboards. They made their own keyboard mechanisms for pianos and synthesizers. That's sort of at the back, and then also the lines for actually making the synthesizers and pianos is there too. The first thing I was assigned was doing a MIDI keyboard, polyphonic MIDI keyboard controller. At that time, Roland had some MIDI keyboard controllers. But this one had polyphonic aftertouch, and that was going to be the first Roland polyphonic aftertouch unit. I did the A-50, and then it was just a slight change to make the A-80, which had a piano touch keyboard from the piano part, much heavier mechanism. But it was the A-50 which was actually the interesting one. And when I was sort of given that project to work, and I was actually working in the piano department. So I was everyone else was working on mostly home pianos, HP, whatevers. and I was just doing this synthesizer thing. It was a mother keyboard, and I had to borrow some sound module synthesizers from the synthesizer department, which was the other side of the office. In where we were in Hosoe main office, we were sort of upstairs. I think it was the top floor, and half of this really big room was the synthesizer department that did things that was, had done the D50 slightly before I'd arrived. The D50 was just out at that time. And the other half was the piano department. And so they put me in the piano department to do this thing. But I had to borrow a bunch of synthesizers because the groups had samples of other companies' products and their own products and things. So I actually had to do this MIDI keyboard controller, I had to borrow a bunch of synthesizers from the synthesizer group, which the head guy was a Mr. Yamabata. And some of them, I remember having an Ensonics and something else, because the Ensonics had polyphonic aftertouch in it. The keyboard had no weights. It was really incredibly light. It was a terrible keyboard if you were actually a keyboard player. But it did polyphonic aftertouch. The sound module did aftertouch. So I'd borrowed that so that I had something to control. And so I ended up designing this A-50. It was the first thing in Roland that actually had a big LCD on it. And this is when I discovered the issues with patents in Japan, is that other companies, and Yamaha in particular, patent everything without actually making some of the things. They didn't actually have a product, and they'd patent some of the technology in that. They just patent lots and lots of things. And one of the things that they had a patent on was polyphonic aftertouch. For example, they had a patent on velocity as well, whereas you press a key and you time how long it takes from there to there, and that's the key velocity. That was like the Yamaha patent. So you couldn't just from one, and keyboards generally have two contacts, so the key goes from there, so it knows when it leaves that one and joins that one. Roland, to get around that patent, they had to do this other thing. It wasn't just a timer counting from there to there. It added this and did this and this and this and this, and it ended up generating an exponential curve value. So just doing something simple was a minefield. And one of the minefields for doing a polyphonic keyboard is that Yamaha's patent had that you only measure the polyphonic touch sensors of the keys being pressed, which is an obvious thing to do, but that's what the patent was. And so I originally tried to do, because it's a performance problem. If you've got a keyboard, then scanning all the keys all the time is a kind of a slow thing to do. Right. And you need more processing power to do that, costs more, or it gives you worse performance. And so I had to get around that type of thing. And that was sort of like the introduction to development at Roland, was getting around the patents that other people had for doing different, what seemed to be obvious things, which is, a kind of a strange thing. But the A-50 was kind of a good get-to-know-you type of project. And it's, I don't know if anyone still uses them. They're like ancient history now. I did them in 1987. They probably released it beginning of 1988. I don't know. I haven't seen one around for a long time. I mean, I personally don't need anything complicated like that. I mean, it does 4 zones and overlap, all sorts of fancy things. But
yeah, and I'm sure from that alone that it has a lot of still uses to this day. I have an EMU 49 key right in front of me with aftertouch and everything, and it's kind of hard to find a MIDI keyboard these days with proper aftertouch support, polyphonic aftertouch support, and even the build quality is missing. And my friend in Washington State, he has a roommate that just got a Yamaha, was it the KX88 MIDI controller?
That was one of the first MIDI controllers.
Yeah. So they got that, and because it's got that rugged metal case, it's just everything back then was just built with a lot more higher quality, like we were talking about earlier with the capacitors and whatnot.
It's like the A-50 and the has the A-50 familiar. It's actually 2 aluminum extrusions which slide together to form the case with plastic bits go on the end. It's actually really, really solid. My manager got into trouble for actually making it that way instead of having just a tin base on it. Well, he got, but the result is a much classier product. And with the price of the thing, it sort of needed it. The other interesting thing about the A-50 and the A-80 I was involved with, it was like the only Roland products that had pitch wheels on them, modulation wheels, because Mr. Kakehashi always said wheels were Yamaha's invention. They weren't. They're actually Bob Moog's invention, but within Japan, it was the Yamaha thing, so they couldn't do them. But I actually put them on Roland pitch bend wheel, pitch and modulation wheels on the A-50. They were up in a different place. They still had a bender on it. But, you know, it's an interesting thing of company philosophy and what the boss says goes. Because wheels are much more. Wheels are more useful than the bender.
No, well, I have this Akai. My very first MIDI controller is just the MPK Mini. Very French fry keys. It's very. And it's got this weird XY joystick controller thing for pitch bend and mod, and it never worked. So it's just like it's just this weird arcade joystick on my MIDI controller. It does absolutely nothing.
The pitch modulation wheels. Well, I mean, the Roland thing's not that bad, but it's not as good as a proper wheel with an indent in the middle. Yeah, it was an interesting exercise. And it was my introduction to the way things do things there. The display on this was actually from Toshiba, the big display, the big display on it. Well, it's not that big by today's standards, but it, meeting the sort of salespeople with my manager went on for many weeks of hours of discussions about just getting this display to use. I found it quite frustrating that there was so much time seemed to be wasted, but that was the normal way of doing business with suppliers.
I wanted to, while we're talking about MIDI controllers, it would be terribly amiss if we didn't mention Dave Smith, who just recently passed away this week. And with Roland having, such a heavy involvement with MIDI, in your manga, you mentioned the gentleman that, really did a lot of the coding of MIDI.
This week, there's lots of pictures on Facebook I saw of the first introduction of MIDI, for example. And there's this guy on the far right of the picture who is Mr. Tamada, who's the guy that actually implemented the code and everything on the Roland side. And his name doesn't even show up most of the time in these pictures. And actually, in a couple of Facebook groups, I actually said, well, and this guy here is Mr. Tamada and did the main thing. He actually did that side of things. And back at Fairlight, we actually received Dave Smith's original proposal for MIDI, and it was on quarter-inch phone jacks. At that time, it was quarter-inch phone jacks, like patch cords for modular synthesizers.
Oh, wow.
And at that time, Peter's opinion, or what became the policy, was that, well, Fairlight doesn't need anybody else. We're a complete standalone system. We do everything ourselves. We don't need to worry about MIDI and connecting to anything else. And so I don't think he didn't respond to the initial request for input in this generating this MIDI thing, but Roland did. And Roland, before MIDI, had a thing called the DCM or something. Right? They had their own connection system for connecting things together before MIDI came along. And a lot of their things came into MIDI, for example, using the 5-pin DIN plugs and using an optical isolator. There's an optical isolator in MIDI so that there's no ground loop between the systems. That was in the original Roland system, which they put into there. So and Mr. Tamada, in these pictures you'll see, I was showing you one I think before. I posted one on Twitter. I'm sure I posted one on Twitter. There's a Mr. Tamada on the right of that, and no one mentions his name. They mention the Roland US people, Mother's Bar, and Tsuruta on the other side, and Dave Smith, but they don't mention the guy on the right who actually did the coding and all this type of stuff, who passed away a few years ago now. So it's kind of interesting. Roland did a lot to make MIDI the way it is. You can say. I actually had the original spec from Dave Smith for many, many years, but I threw it away a long time ago too. I threw away a lot of things when I downsized and moved. It's like, I still have my, the A-50 and the A-50. I've got an A-80 manual as well because I was involved with doing it. It was my schematics and things, but I've thrown everything else away. I mean, I don't have one myself. I've got an A-180, I think it is, under the desk here, a MIDI keyboard controller that the Italians did.
What's the Roland product you're like most proud of?
Well, the only product I actually really got out was the A-50 and the A-80. That was pretty much me and 3 or 4 other guys that did things. I had another young guy, Alta, that did this PCB layouts. My manager at the time, he was involved in organizing all the other main things. I'm still a friend with him on Facebook. That's probably the one that was like the most designed and had most to do with. In the other projects, it's very much bigger, and other people are very much involved with it. I mean, right. All I can say is I influenced a few things. I mean, like I did some because the way I did this Smalltalk system, and I put MIDI on it, and I put interfaces that connect later to a DSP system. I could prototype a whole bunch of things quite quickly because Smalltalk was, fantastic for doing that thing when you knew how to use it. And you gave you graphical interfaces when everybody else just had DOS,
right?
DOS text screens. So it was really quite a useful thing for me. And I did a whole bunch of different things, which I was quite proud of. I did like a DSP modular synthesizer thing, which I did a thing called Human Rhythm. I did a phrase-based music composition system, which I called the AI Music Note, which a small portable thing, which Roland no product group cared about until Roland sometime later produced a QI100, a small VHS tape size music workstation, portable music workstation. And then then later Roland did a thing called the PMA5.
Yeah.
It's a small thing with a stylus, which is sort of the way I demonstrated it. So I had nothing to do with that system, but it was sort of inspired, I guess, or by what I originally did. But the thing with the DSP modular synthesizer that I did, I wanted to make a singing synthesizer. I wanted to make something that sang, because you could sample something that actually sing, and that got squashed. That got squashed. No, we don't need to do anything like that. And it's really quite interesting to me that Yamaha got involved with doing that. There's the Vocaloid.
Yeah.
The Vocaloid was the sort of thing that I really wanted to do. And the Vocaloid ended up becoming this talent pop star type thing in Japan. There's a whole different sort of thing involved with it, a different subculture thing. But when it comes to actually doing a singing voice, I always said, no, we don't need to do that type of thing. And so that was probably, when it comes to them, disappointment. But I got to demonstrate it, and I think it influenced the JP 8000 or something. This was ages before anybody did it. Anyone in Roland did that. I did about a bunch of different things and showed it. Human Rhythm. I did a Human Rhythm type thing, and it was ages later that the R8 Human Rhythm came out. I mean, I never knew they were doing a product, or they'd probably seen my demo about the way I did feel. It was one of the demonstrations I did in Smalltalk V, that I could make feel. I put swing on something. You play something, add swing and take it away, which I thought was a fascinating thing, because other things didn't do it at the time. And I think, and so a Human Rhythm, I don't know what, I never actually used one. So I did a whole bunch of things with inspired products rather than actually, did myself or I even knew much about. Like at one point, when I was originally at Roland, all of their home pianos were these big, dark wooden things, really big things. And I said, well, that's not the way our house is. You got a black plastic TV and all this stuff, and it needs to be small and modern. And they came out with the FP series. I was just talking to some management at one point, right? And they did an FP series a year and a half or two later, And that was sort of what I was talking about, a small, affordable piano, home piano that wasn't, this dark oak wood finished heavy thing. It was a light thing on a modern stand. So the people, I seem to have influenced things even though I wasn't directly involved with them, lots of things. And at the end, the last thing I was involved with was the VP Variphrase processor. Because I wanted to do this, which I called liquid sound, which they got closer to when they did the vSynth, but I'd already left the company when the vSynth product came out. But some of the things in it we'd done before then, and so it was a, things happen slowly in a Japanese company, I think, and it's other people who have control of everything, I did some things and demonstrated some things, and then you say, and then later something else would be maybe inspired by it, even if I wasn't directly involved with it. I mean,
Right.
I was involved with making the demonstration system for what became Variphrase, and we had a plug-in DSP card on a PC, and we had all these control software and a thing for encoding sounds and things that we were involved with developing, and the encoder for making the Variphrase sounds. But when it came to the actual final product, the only thing that I got to do other than the Variphrase code, which is like a wave editor thing which encoded sounds in the 3 different methods that it had, was to the MIDI output part of the encoding. It went through and it could generate a MIDI file along with it, so you could have something to control from a sequencer. In the Variphrase file, there was also a MIDI phrase that's attached to it, which had where the symbols were, and you could move them around and change the pitch independently of what was in the original sound. That was the only thing I actually went into the final product of the actual box, the VP9000. So there's a lot of other people involved with everything when you're doing something. Very different from at Fairlight, where I did half the design, broke it up, and then I had to design and build half of the boards in it, and the other guy worked from a schematic. He built and designed half the things, and we work it out together. Very, very much more hands-on. Not hands-on. You feel there's a much more closer relationship, I guess, with the product than it was. And the A-50 was pretty good, but everything after that was very much only a small member of a team of something or other, which spreads out the responsibility and all that type of thing, but you don't get a whole lot of ownership with it. For example, one of the early things I was asked, was they'd already taken out a trademark on the initials RSS. And for example, I was talking to one of the head of R&D at one point about sound. When you're in a studio, even if you're in a top studio, I had a friend that was an engineer, like a maintenance engineer in the EMI studios in Sydney, the best studios in the country. And even you're playing something on the big monitors, it didn't sound real. It still sounded like it came from speakers. It sounded good, but it was loud, but it didn't, it was just a big PA. And it says, it doesn't sound like you're there. It's not moving around. And they ended up coming up with this thing called RSS, which is Roland Sound Space, which is 3D sound. From 2 speakers, you can have the sound moving around you and things like this. And so I influenced that, and then I ended up RSS. They had already registered a whole bunch of initials, and okay, we have RSS. What should we make it stand for this thing? And I said, Roland Sound Space. So that was just an offhand 5-minute conversation where so I came up with what the RSS standard for when it became to this thing that I talked about, which a whole bunch of other engineers put incredible engineering in for the RSS system. I mean, it was a thing that had pinwheels, and you could move sounds around you and up and down and all sorts of things in using transaural processing. I think if you look at what RSS is now, they reused RSS to be some other product, something or other. I don't know what it was now, but so you influence different things, but it wasn't. It's not that I can say I did that. Unlike Fairlight Series 3, I can say I did that, or the A-80, I did that, or the A-50, I did that. It was like, well, I influenced that, or I did a bit there, or I did a bit of this.
You're probably like one of the last like generations of engineers to like, you know, say that about a product, you know, like, you know, I'm not sure if it, and maybe obviously probably depends on the size of the company and the product, of course, but like, you know, especially for like a corporation, I'm not sure of how many people can say like, you know, singularly that that's my design or engineering component, you know?
Yeah. It's like you influenced, you
Right.
pushed it in that direction, or you came up with the same name. But yeah, you know. So I was there. I spent 6 years at Fairlight, but then I spent, including the time I was in Australia, to like about 15 years with Roland, and I was very much at Fairlight. I was a backroom guy, designer, you know, designing things and building things and testing things and writing test code for stuff. But in Roland, I was, you know, asked about all sorts of opinions. I developed a couple of products, but then I was involved with R&D, and I went to lots of conferences, and I was involved with. I saw much more of the world. I traveled to all over America, attending computer music conferences, or the AES show, or the this or that, or meeting up someone and doing something else, or going to Europe. I mean, it was a much different view of the industry, I think, or, you know, I had a very small view in while I was in Australia, and that's, and Roland is not what it was.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Roland, in 2014, Kakehashi was sort of like effectively pushed out by the then Mickey and a bunch of venture capitalists, Cayman Island-based venture capitalists, who took over the company. They made it private, and then they sold off a lot of stuff. There used to be Roland, so many Roland offices in all sorts of different countries, and they all got rid of them, and I don't know what else they all did. And they actually came back on the stock market again. Was it 2 years ago? A year and a half ago? Maybe a year and a half ago. They're back on the stock market again. And shortly after that, the Mr. Mickey, who was involved with all doing this, stepped down, and the new CEO of Roland is an Englishman living in England. So I actually did a post about that, and I have it somewhere, but I can't think of his name offhand. I just don't remember his name offhand again. And most of the products that Roland have been making have been sort of, one of the things that Mr. Kakehashi hated was like small keyboard, mini-sized keyboard keys and things like that. But since he'd gone, that they could then make products with small keyboards, or, for example, I have the thing that I can use most is I've got a little Korg, you know, nano keys. It's really convenient. Yeah. You don't have much keyboard space. They started putting small keyboards on different things, you know, which I find kind of strange why Kakehashi was so against it, because one of the hugely popular products they did way back when was a TB303, which had this, you know, little keyboard on it. One octave, 1.5 octave keyboard on it, just using key switches. And, you know, many electronic people, music people, perfectly fine with that type of thing. You know, so, you know, moving Mr. Kakehashi out did allow them to do a lot of, you know, things that he wouldn't allow. He also, for example, pushed home organs a lot. You know, home organs was his thing, you know, big organs with multiple, you know, keyboards and pedals and all this type of thing. I don't know if they're still making them now, but I know that they sold when the company went private, they sold off the Rogers organ and a few other things that they had, which were doing those type of products for.
You know, I would love to keep on talking and everything, but we're starting to run out of time, so we'll go ahead and start wrapping up. But you know, maybe in the future we could have another one of these if that's something you're interested in. But yeah, Adrian, thank you so much for being a part of this and for telling us the various stories and everything. I really, really appreciate it. And for people who are interested and wanted to check out the manga and check out your music on Bandcamp and your art, do you have any links or anything you want to share?
Yeah, it's all accessible from my artandtechnology.com.au website, where it goes off to Bandcamp and other places, blog and all sorts of different things. And I still have the Australian hosted website because it's just too difficult to get into the Google. If you actually change it and move a site, it's been there for years and it's going to stay there. It cost me about the same anyway, even though I'm now in Japan. The website's still in Australia. It doesn't make any difference if I'm here.
But no, I mean, and I highly recommend people who are interested in, just music history or history in Japan or want to learn more about you. I highly recommend checking out the manga out there. It's really awesome. And, and Adrian, again, thank you for, all of your work and for coming on here to spend time and talk with me about this. This is it's an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking me.